why even think about this topic? It's a topic that in the UK is getting a great deal of energy from government, as illustrated by the funding and formation of the National Innovation Centre for Ageing. It's a global challenge with global opportunities, and is part of the UK industrial strategy as harnessing the power of innovation to help meet the needs of an ageing society. The Prime Minister has spoken on this matter and set out a healthy ageing mission to extend healthy life expectancy by 5 years and narrow the gap between the experiences of the richest and poorest within the UK. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of that later on. And there are numerous European initiatives as well in this space, including the European Innovation Partnership for Active and Healthy Aging. And this all goes back to this steady increase in life expectancy amongst the leading nations over the best part of 200 years, which we didn't really notice until about 30 years ago when the mechanisms started to change. There is a caution that this is the leading nations. They change. They're not always the same ones. And in the UK, over the last 4 or 5 years, both locally and nationally, we've started to see a decline in healthy life expectancy, which is somewhat troubling. What happened in the last sort of 30, 40 years is that we changed from a situation where that life expectancy increase was driven by reduction in infant mortality, infectious disease, and health and safety and things like that, hygiene, to something that was driven much more medically by medical intervention in later life. And that's keeping that. So we've stopped increasing the life expectancy of people who might have lost their lives in what we might consider the productive stage of their life, their working lives, and we've started to increase life expectancy almost for those post-retirement. And that's combined with reducing fertility is changing the shape of society as we experience it. And this shows the population distribution in the UK in 2012 and a prediction in 2037. And you can see this huge growth in the sort of 70 plus area, and a narrowing at the bottom, which is not quite as discernible as it is in many nations, which are now experiencing a very severe tuck underneath. If we do, as we may well do, apply much more rigid immigration policies than we have done in the past, that will only get worse, because many of the younger people that we've been bringing into the country we've been importing rather than breeding for ourselves. So that prediction may well not show the reduction in the younger age groups that might actually come to pass. So we end up with a society which has more older people in it. That doesn't necessarily mean we're only worried about the older people. What we end up with is a challenge, if you like, of maintaining an efficient, effective society in which we have an older average age, as well as many more older people. So we need to understand what's happening to us as we get older. And these are some of the things that consumers perceive happen to them as they get older. It's a wide range of problems, including increased weight, difficulty sleeping, pain, feeling as able to move about as much, and various other issues. And some of those very, very high prevalence, so a general slowing down, 70% of people saying that they experience that. And in most cases, at least half of those people are attributing these sorts of issues to aging, and in all probability quite rightly so. What we're actually seeing is a slight degradation in our mental performance with time, changes in our visual accommodation with time, changes in our hearing, degradation of our hearing, particularly in certain frequencies, a loss of sensitivity in touch, weakening grip strength, and changes in our sense of smell. All of these things are going on, and for a variety of undergoing a variety of mechanisms, and are changing the way in which we actually experience our lives as we get older. This is some work from a while back from Tom Kirkwood, who used to lead the ageing research in Newcastle until reasonably recently. And this shows how the changes are created by accumulation of defects, initially cellular defects, but those combine to create defects in tissues and then in organs, which degrades the performance of those organs. It's driven by environment, by stress, by poor nutrition and inflammation, and can be improved, countered by better lifestyle, good nutrition, and wise use of anti-inflammatories. And this shows how the healthy tissues, through those damaging effects across the top there, including things like unhealthy diet, stress, smoking, etc., lead to tissue compromise, which leads to these various failures and disease conditions, and how that can be, to some extent, repaired, or the repair mechanisms can be improved by appropriate diet, physical activity, getting the right amount of sleep, and not being overweight. Building one. So again, we've got the similar representation there of healthy diet, adequate physical activity, and good sleep pushing us in one direction, and the poorer behaviours, poor diet, smoking, etc., pushing us in the other direction. And we start with a situation of a kind of healthy balance where all our organs are kind of regulated and working together. We get a drift on that homeostasis and reduced responsiveness to triggers, which eventually lead to metabolic dysregulation and then on to disease and dysfunction. It's not a one-way street, and we can do something about it because we can improve the way that we deal with things. But the problem is that the information that we have is far from perfect. These are very gradual changes that we almost ignore until they get to a particularly damaged position. So whilst we're in that sort of homeostatic drift stage, we're probably pretty much unaware of the fact that this is happening. We might get colds and sniffles and things a bit more often and be a bit more prone to illness. We might feel a bit more tired. We might look shocking. But it's unlikely that this is something that's going to send us scurrying to the doctor in a hurry. Even as we start to get more metabolic dysregulation, while there may be measurable changes in what's going on in our body that we might detect through a screening system or some other checks, these are probably not things that are going to drive us to go and have those checks. So they're not things that are going to have us knocking on the GP's door. So we're only going to catch them when people do that. And so by the time people do go and say, I have this problem, doc, they've probably got an established disease condition. So what we need to do is identify these things earlier, and that's where the diagnostic and screening approach comes in and becomes very important. Because if we're going to live longer, we want to live longer in the far end or the middle of this stage where we're feeling well and functioning well. We don't want to live longer in this area where we've got disease. We need help and support. We don't want that because it degrades our independence, it degrades our dignity, and we need lots of support from other people. Our families don't want it because it interrupts their lives considerably as they try and provide us with that support and care, and it's expensive for the state. Or it severely erodes the children's inheritance, one or the other. What we find is that this process is going on in multiple systems at the same time, and in a fairly random way. So as a result, we can see from this graph that whilst people quite young may have disorders, as you go up in age, there's a progression of the likelihood of having a number of disorders. And once we get into our 70s and 80s, the chances are we might have a very considerable number, 5 or more diseases or disorders at the same time. It is possible to get to a very great age without having any, but it's rare. And it happens in a few people, mostly women, in a very small number of places, mostly places like California. Those people are very rich and probably have so much done for them that they probably don't even notice when they do have a problem. So multimorbidity is normal, and this was from the 85+ study, which was performed here in Newcastle. The people that were in that study were measured between their 85th and 90th year. They're approaching 100 now, and we didn't find anybody in that study who didn't have at least one disease. It covered everybody born in that year in Newcastle and North Tyneside. As you can see, as the previous graph predicted, the majority of people had 4 or 5 challenges at the same time. Yet they were relatively happy with their health. So actually, people are happy, people are comfortable, people are functioning. They are independent with this number of multiple conditions. And the reason is that these conditions are not necessarily extreme. So they could be multiple or an accumulation of relatively low-level challenges and functional disorders, which are in themselves manageable, but when they start to build up in numbers can become more and more difficult until we reach a point where we are so physically frail that any disturbance from our normal routine or any further illness or injury causes a kind of catastrophic failure in the system. This gives us a hint at some of the things that we really don't want to have. So hypertension there is linked into just about every other disease and condition in that graph. So of the people that had hypertension, large numbers had coronary heart disease, heart failure, stroke, diabetes, depression, dementia, etc. So really, that's one of the things that we want to avoid, like the plague. But others there also quite considerably influential. Even depression, the chances of if you're depressed, the chances of you having other diseases along with that is quite considerable. So how do we deal with all this? Now, closed loop medicine is a particular organisation with a particular approach, but it's an approach that is quite valid, and it's around integrating a whole load of activities. So guidelines and things from the formulary need to interact with devices and interventions, but those devices and interventions need to interact with each other, communicate in a way that distributes information appropriately, combines information in a sensible and useful way, allows us to use technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand more about what's going on from the collection of that data. We have to be a bit careful with the numbers along here because, as I said previously, some people don't experience these things at the same time. There's a very wide range of times at which people will start to see themselves to be less able or start to lose capability. But we can see that most people still stop working around about what we have always considered to be, or for a long time we've considered to be, retirement age. And that does, to some extent, coincide with reducing capability, with morbidity, and subsequent disability and mortality. But clearly we don't want to wait till then. We don't want to wait until people are damaged and then try to make the best of it. What we want to do is identify and prevent. And some of that may mean intervening in people when they are busy, when they are managing families, when they are working, when they're caring, etc. So this makes intervention more challenging, and it makes identification a lot more challenging because people have a lot of distractions. They don't necessarily know or understand what they need to do. Once we do start to decline with age-related decline, if we are well, it happens in a fairly predictable way, in a fairly predictable order. And this is work that's done by Carol Jagger, an epidemiologist of aging here in Newcastle, working with Peter Gore, who's actually a professor of practice and has a business in assisted living and matching people to assisted living technologies. And they identified that these things happen in a predictable order, but that they happen at considerably different paces for different people. The worst case is that people start to decline very rapidly, and they move through these different stages. So the first one on the top, which always gets people talking, is being able to cut your own toenails. That's an issue of flexibility. And our first director used to get quite upset when we told him that he was already on this curve of decline, because whilst he could run the Great North Run quite happily, he couldn't reach to cut his own toenails. Now that's fine because he's probably got someone to do that for him. But it does mean that he has this underlying challenge, which will only continue to get worse unless he does something about it. If he does nothing about it, then it will impact his ability to do other things more rapidly, and he will take a lower curve than he might have done if he'd done something about that flexibility. So the important thing about this graph is that the bottom is not death, it's sort of total care. So those two lines will end at about the same point. They will meet at some stage, and death would occur for both of those individuals at round about the same time, which means that the person who takes that lower trajectory will need total care for perhaps 3 or 4 years, whilst the person who takes the higher trajectory may only need 6 months of intensive care and support. That's a very big difference economically. It's a huge difference in terms of our dignity and our self-efficacy. What we need to do is to try to make sure people take that higher route. To make sure people take that higher route, we've got to identify that the changes are happening. We've got to start to behave rather differently from the way we do now and actually intervene early to restore that capability. If we can't restore that capability, and only if we can't restore that capability, do we give technology to help to allow people to do it with support, and only if we can't find a technological solution do we then provide care, because over-caring is damaging in itself. It gives people a sense of helplessness and a learned helplessness, and tends to speed up people's loss of capability. I mentioned that this doesn't happen to everyone at the same rate, and this is the expected age of onset for disability, so effectively the healthy life expectancy for 55-year-olds. This is in Newcastle, so you can see that people in Byker will become ill or disabled 10 years earlier than people in wealthy Ponteland, yet these are only a few minutes apart. They will also die earlier and be ill longer, so it's really bad if you're stuck in that end of the world. And that's because of a variety of different inequalities. There are behavioural issues there are lifestyle issues which are within the control of the individuals, there are lifestyle issues which are outside of the control of the issues, like the standard of accommodation that's available to people in these areas, which may lead or support mental health issues. Mental health issues lead to physical health problems. So we need to make sure that if we're going to intervene, we intervene in fair ways. So it isn't particularly helpful for us to create wonderful things to go into the marketplace to individual customers who are wealthy enough to buy them, because that just pushes the social divide even further apart. If we're going to use that sort of mechanism, we also need to find mechanisms whereby we can cross-subsidise or provide charity-supported interventions in poorer areas, so that we don't create that increased unfairness in the population. Some slides about the factors that seem to suggest that people will do better. So this was all about people who lived their lives in socio-economically challenged areas, and Some did very much better than others, and things like not having a lot of childhood illness, avoiding obesity, being more kind of self-able, and also more active and not smoking, all helped people to do better, even though they came from poorer backgrounds. In this case, they found that marital status and contact with others didn't particularly change that. This study suggests that if you're an unmarried male, it's really bad for you, probably because you don't look after yourself very well in that situation. But the main drivers are things like high alcohol intake, smoking, and then indicators of things like having a low grip strength. Poor levels of education also don't help you. And that's something that is particularly evident in this. This is a representation of different drivers of dementia, and you can see that some of that is education related. We focus education a great deal on the young. If you miss it, it's too bad, it's gone. So let's start to think about through life education, giving people opportunity to be challenged mentally and intellectually throughout their lives. There are inflammation type pathways there caused by irritation or illness, which affect the brain. And there are also sort of physiological things like obesity, smoking, things like that. And so at least a third of the drivers of dementia could be addressed if people understood that they were causing them an issue or likely to cause them an issue and were driven to behave differently. So a lot of work is going on into identifying these biomarkers that we can use to understand what's going on in people who are apparently healthy but are aging. It's a complex space, though. So there are physical biomarkers and biomarkers of physical capability, of physiological function, of endocrine function, immune system function, cognitive function. You need a good picture of these, a good cross-section of these to really understand how someone is aging, because as I said before, these are processes which are going on in all of these systems at the same time and interacting in complex ways to actually create the sorts of challenges that we see in later life. We have interactions between interventions and challenges. What are our genetics? Our genetic makeup influences this a bit, about a third. What drugs we're given and use, how our metabolites work, our diet and our exercise regimes. Those are all impinging on the way that our body reacts to that and creates these hallmarks of aging, which then move through to age-related phenomenon and disease or conditions that we might recognize in later life. And we're starting to understand a little bit about genetic propensity for these sorts of things, but it is small, and we know it isn't one of although it probably accounts for about a quarter to a third of our experience of aging, it isn't the whole picture by any means. And our behavior and our life situation and things like that probably have a much heavier weighting. But we can use that to identify people who may be at risk. And there's work here, again, at the 85 Plus study, looking at the bloods taken from individuals who took part in that study, trying to associate age-related frailty and biomarkers that indicate that is happening. And those programs are going on in a number of places now to try to see whether we can get ahead of the game and start to understand people's biological age rather than their chronological age. And I think this is probably one of the last slides now. And this is a success story, really, for Newcastle. So we started with an intervention for diabetes. It was developed academically and adopted within a small number of NHS centres. It was exercise-based rather than medicine, so there were all sorts of challenges involved, like teaching GPs how to prescribe it, teaching them how to monitor it, even persuading them to prescribe it because they're much more comfortable with medicines which they've been taught to use and manage. that system was set into a mechanism, but it was very health service focused. We took that into Europe through an EIT health project, working with Philips and Achmea, one of the leading insurance groups within Europe, and positioned it as a lifestyle management tool, because it was about exercise, it was about activity. So the insurance company made it available to their clients. Their clients were, it's a health insurance company, their clients were encouraged to use this tool to change their behavior, and that was monitored, their usage was monitored, and that resulted in reductions in their premium to create their behavior. So the company, Changing Health, has now gone on to sell that to a number of insurance companies across Europe, as well as its earlier program of work, its earlier market with the NHS as an intervention in health for people who already had type 2 diabetes. So this presentation wouldn't be quite complete without a little bit of an advert for the National Innovation Centre for Ageing. So we do have a program of working with businesses. We have staff who will act as go-betweens between academia and businesses to try to help transfer knowledge more swiftly and more appropriately out of the universities and into businesses. We spend quite a lot of effort in trying to create insights and understanding about ageing, not only from research but also from public agendas and public wishes and aspirations, citizens' wishes and aspirations. And we try to communicate those through emerging teaching and learning, which is at a very early stage at the moment. And all of this is focused on the National Innovation Centre's, actually has a dual role. It has a role as a catalyst for economic growth, much like the AHSN, but it also has a role in improving the lives of older people. And so there is a social component of what we're established to achieve as well. If you think that this is an area that is relevant to your work, then we'd certainly be more than happy to talk to you. And you can either catch me later or actually Age Innovation at newcastle.ac.uk will connect you to the appropriate member of our team for any question you might want to ask. Thank you very much. Any questions? Sorry? Vesicles as a biomarker. Right. I probably can't tell you a huge amount about it because I don't know a great deal about the literature on biomarkers specifically, but perhaps if we discuss later, I could probably point you to the right person. Yeah.
Do you think the bigger problem is, and potentially where technology can have a bigger impact, is in the early diagnosis of disease state or in changing people's behaviour or society's behaviour?
I suspect that the real benefit is from changing behaviour, but that change in behaviour often needs to be driven by very individual information about potential risk and maybe current disease state for people. It actually takes quite a powerful nudge to move someone permanently onto a different trajectory. You know, we're familiar with people trying diets and dropping them after a few weeks. We all enroll for the gym every year in January and then never go. All of those things we're kind of familiar with. So actually I think what the technology can do is give people a good understanding of their position in the world compared to others, compared to their peers, their challenges, their level of risk, and support that with ideas about how they could address that, the importance that they should address that in order to really shape and support behavioural change.